Today we're going to introduce you to another type of clause that is going to sound unfamiliar, but when you start listening to what it's about, it's going to actually be a familiar type of clause. We're also going to talk about a third type of sentence. We've already talked about simple and compound. So we're going to talk today about adverb clauses and complex sentences. We're going to do it in that order today. So let's start with the adverb clause. An adverb clause is a dependent clause. And we've talked already about independent and dependent clauses. This is a group of words that does not make sense by itself, that needs to be supported or added to an independent clause to make sense. So the adverb clause adds detail to a verb or an adjective or an adverb in the sentence. It tells more about what the verb is doing in the sentence that you're reading. Adverb clauses help us answer the following questions. They add the following detail to the sentences they're in. They answer the questions of how something happened or to what extent something happened, when it happened, how much happened, where did it happen, how long did it take place for, and why did it happen. You can find an adverb clause typically by using the same conjunctions that we had on the front of our previous packet. And this list should look familiar. There might be a couple here that you don't have on the other chart, and this would be a good place to pause and to add those to your conjunction list so that you have a even more complete list of conjunctions to identify where clauses are. You might not have as if or as long as or as much as soon as though, how, or in order that. These are all conjunction words or phrases that could begin an adverb clause. So let's look at a couple examples with that chart in mind. We have this sentence, I feel as though I will never catch up. When we look at that chart that we just showed you, both the word as and the phrase as though are on that chart that signify this is where an adverb clause begins. So most of the sentence here, as though I will never catch up, is the adverb clause, and it tells how I feel. I is the subject, feel is the verb, and how do you feel? I feel as though I will never catch up. Another example, after I finish painting my bookcases, I will call you. This one's really nice because it has a comma in the middle and it separates your sentence into two clauses. And one of the clauses will be dependent and one of the clauses will be independent. In other words, one will make sense by itself and one will not. The dependent clause in this one is after I finish painting my bookcases. That is the adverb clause. The subject is I, the verbs are will, call, and the adverb clause helps answer the question of when I will call you. You can think of it like such as I will call you. Okay, when will you call me? I will call you after I finish painting my bookcases. And then our third and final example here, I have more work to do today because I didn't paint yesterday. The subject here is I. The verbs are have work. And so if we're looking then for I have work, well, why do you have work? Because I didn't paint yesterday. So that adverb clause tells us why we have more work. So again, adverb clauses are dependent clauses. They need an independent clause with them to make sense. And they're going to begin with one of those words typically that was on the chart earlier in these slides. One sentence type that you can find adverb clauses in is complex sentences. Now, we've already covered independent and dependent clauses. We've covered simple sentences, which have one independent clause. We have compound sentences that have two independent clauses. And now we're going to deal with dependent clauses in a sentence. So a complex sentence contains one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. One independent and one dependent. One that makes sense by itself and one that needs help. And they're put together in a sentence called a complex sentence. Reminder, there are two kinds of dependent clauses. There's the one we just talked about, which are adverb clauses. And then there's maybe the easiest kind of clause to find, and that's the adjective clause. Let me just explain why they're so easy to find. Adjective clauses always, and it says usually there, but always begin with one of these relative pronouns. Who, whom, whose, which, and that. If you are given a sentence and it has an underlined section, and they're asking you, what is this, an adverb clause or an adjective clause? If the part underlined begins with who, whom, whose, which, or that, it is an adjective clause every time. If it begins with anything else, including some of these dependent conjunctions, after, as, because, if, since, then, anything off the charts that we've had on your handouts, if it begins with anything other than who, whom, whose, which, and that, it's an adverb clause. So remember, adjective clauses begin with who, whom, whose, which, and that. Any other dependent clause is going to be an adverb clause. Let's look at some examples here. Patricia Roberts Harris, who served as President Carter's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, was the first African American woman to be a cabinet member. So we've got commas after the word Harris and after the word development. So right in the middle of our sentence, we have a dependent clause. If I was to ask you, is it an adjective clause or an adverb clause? Look at what the word begins with. It begins with who. And we just got done saying if it starts with who, whom, whose, which, or that, it is an adjective clause. We would describe what you see here on the screen then as a complex sentence with an adjective clause. To take it one step further, you might be asked, well, what's the subject and what's the verb? You will never find the subject of a sentence in the dependent clause. The part that doesn't make sense by itself. You will never find the subject in the dependent clause. So look at what is not underlined. And the subject is Patricia Roberts Harris. That is who the sentence is about. Then you look at the part after the dependent clause. That's after the part that's underlined. And you find a linking verb, was. So Patricia Roberts Harris was. This is a complex sentence with an adjective clause. The subject is Patricia Roberts Harris. The verb is was. Let's move on to another example. Here's the sentence. When I hear classical music, I think of Aunt Sophia. So first question we need to do is, what is the dependent clause? The dependent clause in this case is when I hear classical music. You got the comma that separates the sentence in half. One half is dependent, one half independent. One half makes sense by itself, one half does not. I see when I hear classical music, that is a dependent clause. Then I ask, well, is it a complex sentence with an adverb clause or is it a complex sentence with an adjective clause? Because it begins with the words when, and it's not who, whom, whose, which, or that, That makes this a complex sentence with an adverb clause. Okay. What we're left with, I think, of Aunt Sophia is the independent clause, the part that makes sense by itself. And if I was to ask you what the subject and verb of the sentence is, you would say the subject is I. The sentence is about I. And the verb is think. So when I think of Aunt Sophia. Complex sentence with an adverb clause, subject is I, verb is think. One final example. One interesting annual event that is held in the Southwest is the Intertribal Indian Ceremonial, which involves many different American Indian peoples. This complex sentence has not one but two dependent clauses in it. They are the first one, that is held in the Southwest, and then the second one is which involves many different American Indian peoples. As you look at those two underlined sections, which are dependent clauses, don't make sense by themselves, you look at how those two begin, what words those two clauses begin with, and you decide that they are adjective clauses because they begin with one of those relative pronouns: who, whom, whose, which, and that. So we have a complex sentence with adjective clauses in it. Then the final question becomes, well, what then is the subject and verb or verbs of this sentence? As we go through, we decide that the subject cannot be in any section that is underlined. And if we have to narrow the subject down to a single word, we would say the subject is the word event. And I start looking then later in the sentence. I don't see any action verbs. I don't see any helping verbs that have to be with action verbs. So therefore, I have to say this verb is the word is, and that is, of course, a linking verb. As you look at the continuation of this packet, this blue packet you have in front of you, there's three exercises. And the first one, you identify the adverb clause in each of the sentences. The second one, you take the adverb clause that we give you and you make a sentence that includes it, either at the beginning or in the middle or at the end. You can put that adverb clause wherever you'd like, but it has to be included in the sentence. And then the third one is to find clauses, prepositions, and pronouns in these complex sentences.